This is the Infrastructure Matters podcast, brought to you by the Futurum Group. We explore the latest developments in hybrid cloud computing and the technology that underpins it. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the hybrid cloud computing landscape. The Infrastructure Matters podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take anything reflected in this show as investment advice. Now your co-hosts, Stephen Dickens, Camberly Bates, and Krista Macomber of the Futurum Group.
Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Infrastructure Matters. I'm joined this week by Krista Macomber. Hey Krista, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Stephen. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. We're recording on the 5th of July, so fantastic to have a couple of days out. I hope you had a good time with the family and chance to chill out.
It was nice to get a little bit of relaxation in. I'm here in New Hampshire, so in the Boston area, and it was unfortunately super rainy, so a little bit of a disappointment from that perspective, but still good, as you say, to be able to relax and see some family and friends. How about yourself?
Yeah, same. I'm up in the sort of 100 miles north of New York, so the weather wasn't great, but chance to chill out and avoid the storms a little bit. But that gives us a nice segue straight into the news section. Obviously, a quiet news week last week, running into the holidays. A lot of the tech vendors sort of taking the opportunity to hit pause on the press machine. But a couple of big announcements that came out that we covered here at Futurum Group were IBM making an acquisition of Apptio, which was big news. Kind of dominated the cycle last week, given the size of that acquisition. And then the other one was BMC announcing their Amy Cloud portfolio. So I'll dive in on both of those because I covered them pretty extensively. Apptio's interesting, largest acquisition by IBM since the Red Hat acquisition back in 2019. 4.6 billion is the number we're hearing. Interestingly, going to give IBM an integration challenge in the FinOps space. I wrote a Forbes article on this and also covered it. One of our team covered it, Todd, on the Futurum site. Really interesting that IBM's kind of made a series of acquisitions, most notably recently with Turbonomic in this FinOps space, where they're really trying to get a handle on people's cloud and hybrid cloud spend. This isn't just a public cloud story. So I think really interesting. IBM briefed us last week. I see this making a lot of sense. As I mentioned, the only kind of asterisk to my positivity is IBM's got 3 or 4 solutions in this space now. So it's going to be fascinating to see what they do from an integration point of view.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. And I know we kind of talk a little bit about, touching a bit on cloud repatriation and how as customers are migrating to the cloud, it's not always as cheap or as inexpensive as they were initially expecting, and just the number of levers that kind of go into that. So certainly, as you mentioned, it'll be interesting to see how those pieces come together and what ends up coming with that portfolio.
Yeah, I think IBM's got the brand permission to be in this space. I think they're a trusted vendor in this space. Level of neutrality from the hyperscalers. They've obviously got their own cloud offering, but I don't think even IBM are talking about that now as a competitor for AWS, Azure, and GCP. So I think CIOs are going to trust, and increasingly CFOs are going to trust IBM in this space, I feel. So it's going to be fascinating to see how not only they do the integration work, because there's, as I say, there's 3 or 4 products and solutions that they've got in this space, either that were purely in this space or that were kind of adjacent. But I think the other piece is how they connected into their wider sort of OpenShift an Ansible automation story. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think big bet from Arvin, 4.6 billion, not the 34 billion they spent on OpenShift, but and the Red Hat portfolio, but certainly a big statement of intent that IBM plans to double down in the FinOps space. The other news last week, which we were involved with, was the BMC Amy Cloud portfolio coming to market. They made an acquisition of a software cloud software provider in the mainframe space called Model 9 a few weeks back, which we covered. That closed, and BMC announced their Amy Cloud portfolio. We covered this. We did some commissioned research looking into this space. I think fascinating for me to see that there is still an opportunity for mainframe software vendors to break into the market, get some traction, and then get an exit. I think people see the mainframe space as a pretty traditional, pretty established part of the market, but Gil Kellogg and the Model 9 team over the last 3 or 4 years have done a great job of kind of splashing into the market, gaining traction, establishing product market fit, and really sort of getting onto the radar of one of the big vendors in BMC in this space. So I think makes sense from a BMC perspective. I think they've got a really strong storage portfolio, and moving that into a hybrid cloud model and allowing people to put their mainframe data in the cloud makes a lot of sense. So those were the two big news items. As I say, quiet news week. We expect the press release engine to kick off next week in full effect. I think the PR teams will take a rest again this week. So maybe next week's podcast is going to be interesting. We maybe have to record on Friday rather than midweek.
Right, for sure.
We don't get many pauses in the schedule, but we will take it while we can.
Exactly. And I think, Stephen, maybe the only other component I would add from a news perspective is in our first episode of Infrastructure Matters that we recorded with Kimberly, we did touch on the NetApp Analyst Summit and a number of the developments that NetApp is doing pertaining to cyber resiliency and BlueXP, which is essentially its kind of management plane for multi-cloud operations and things of that nature. Those features are available now. So if anyone is interested, our colleague Mitch Lewis actually wrote a blog about that. And of course, folks can kind of go ahead and listen to our first episode of Infrastructure Matters as well for some additional context there. But I think from my perspective, that's probably the other news item that I would throw in the hopper there.
Fantastic. So basically the structure of the show here is we cover the news, light news week this week, but then we go into a deep dive topic and get the chance to double click. And really I'm playing the supporting act here to Krista, who's going to go through from a zero trust perspective. I think my perspective, really interesting to see how this has gone from deep technical to marketing term over the last couple of years. So that's maybe a perspective I'd like you to elaborate on, but take us away and sort of walk us through where you see zero trust and maybe how that's evolved.
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. And you raise a couple of great points. I think the first point being that this is a concept that at this point has been around for quite some time, for several years at this point. And the other point being that this is kind of becoming a little bit of a marketecture, or at minimum, it is being very heavily used in vendor marketing language. So, I think we kind of put our heads together and thought this would be a good topic because when we do speak with IT operations teams, sometimes there's a little bit of not necessarily maybe confusion, but just kind of wanting to really, like you say, bring this down to some of the technical and also the policy components, to understand more specifically what exactly is it that we're referring to when we think about zero trust.
Well,
So,
maybe let's start there. What's I mean, you're obviously one of the preeminent thinkers in this space, thought leader. That's why we've got you on the payroll as somebody who's fantastic and knowledgeable in this space. What would your definition of zero trust be? Where would you start?
sure. Yeah. So I think what I like to do when I have conversations about it is begin by contrasting, if this is something new, where are we coming from? And what is sort of the traditional model? And what we see is that the traditional model for kind of a general security architecture tends to be very what we call perimeter based. And so really what that means is that it's heavily dependent on the network, in that once a user account or once a device is granted access inside that network, that it is then sort of trusted by default, and that it has a very broad level of access, whether that be to data, whether that be to applications, other components of the infrastructure. Um, so it's sort of this concept of you're innocent until proven guilty. But what we're seeing is that with ransomware, data extortion, and all of these cyber attacks just continuing to be on the rise, that we really need to kind of shift that paradigm. And we need to shift that paradigm to assume that, in fact, no user or no device can be trusted, even if it is already inside the network. So, from my perspective, that's sort of the guiding principle behind zero trust. And I think at the same time, also why we're tending to hear so much about it these days with all of these cyber attacks.
So, if it's the principle of previously you came onto a network as a device or as a user and you were trusted, we're
Hmm.
flipping that to say even when you're onto a network or or as a device or as a user, you're now not trusted. Is that the most
Hmm.
simple way to think about it?
That is a simple way, kind of a simplified way to think about it. And really, what it breaks down to is that every single access request is going to be evaluated before the access is granted. So there's really this kind of scrutiny, and the scrutiny within context, of, okay, what is the user account, for example, the user ID that is requesting this access? Where is it located? Things of that nature. So that's kind of one way that we're seeing this begin to be implemented. But of course, we can talk more about, especially following the theme of this podcast, we can certainly talk a little bit more about what that means technically, especially from an infrastructure standpoint.
Well, that was where I was going to go next. If we've established zero trust as a concept, where are you seeing that be deployed in the infrastructure? This is an infrastructure podcast. So where are
Yes.
you
Yep.
seeing that?
Yeah.
Is it various layers? Is it various components of the architecture? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I would say that it is at a number of different layers. So when we think about infrastructure, and in particular, my role tending to focus very closely on data protection and data security, we do tend to start with access control, certainly. So even if you are going to further scrutinize this user account, you do want to make sure that the that there is the appropriate role-based access control, multi-factor authentication, and some of those best practices, are implemented up front, because that certainly can help from a, a rogue user, an attacker, from gaining access. But really, what we see is we need to see that be paired with what we're kind of describing as a concept of least privilege. So, looking at that particular user and saying, what really is the minimum level of access that user needs, in particular when it comes to access to things like sensitive data, in order to do their job. So really, it's sort of what exactly do they need to know? What really do they need access to? And trying to contain that particular user to just those assets that they need the access to.
So is this new capability and features and functions in existing solutions typically, rather than,
Yeah,
I'll pick on firewalls as a kind of thing that you deploy in a network. Are you seeing
yeah.
new zero trust devices, or is this a feature on top of an existing device?
It's a great question. And I would say that, so you bring up kind of an interesting example with firewalls. So what we're seeing is that there are upgrades, wouldn't be really the best way to put it, but there are what we're kind of calling like next generation firewalls that have capabilities such as micro segmentation, which really kind of breaks up the network into small isolated areas to be able to limit lateral, what we call lateral access. So if an attacker does gain access to that one particular area of the network, they're controlled and then they can't wreak further havoc elsewhere in the network. So that's a great example where that is likely something that would be in addition to something that would be additive to what is already kind of deployed and implemented. And that of course can create a number of challenges, right? And we do see that there are some challenges when we think about being able to really make this vision of zero trust a reality. That typically it does require some investment in new technologies, which of course then requires that these new technologies be implemented alongside what is already existing.
So, I mean, if the target audience of this podcast is kind of heads of infrastructure in
Mhm.
enterprises, is that the simple way to think about this? Hey, I'm going to need to deploy the latest version of insert name of product or solution or piece of infrastructure in order to implement zero trust? Is it as simple as that, or is it more a people process as well as tools and platform discussion?
Yeah, it's certainly people and processes as well. I mean, so to answer the technical side of things, I would say certainly, taking a step back and kind of, maybe auditing the existing environment for, like I mentioned, some of these access control capabilities, do you have maybe microsegmentation implemented within your network where applicable, to then kind of identify what are some of the additional capabilities or technologies that need to be kind of implemented, so I really understand where the holes are at. So I would say it's maybe a little bit less about keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, and just deploying the latest, but maybe it's more about taking stock of, um, you know, where are your potential holes and what is needed to fill those. And certainly it is about, like I mentioned, the people and processes as well. And that becomes a little bit of a challenge because it means that our IT operations teams, they are going to have to work closely, for example, with their organization's cybersecurity team, for example, to understand what are some of the likely vulnerabilities. They might even need to kind of also include business leaders in that conversation to understand, where is the critical data, who really are the critical users, and to be able to kind of create some guardrails around, those access control parameters that I was mentioning earlier. Um, and we do see that in some cases, vendors are, working to bring to the table, some kind of services that maybe can help with this. And I can touch on that a little bit more. But does that help to paint a little bit of a clearer picture
Oh
there?
yeah, it's interesting, and I mentioned it on the introduction here, and your dog wants to join in, which is fantastic. And we're
I
talking about
so
a dog show.
apologize.
No, no, I mean, I think everybody's tuned into pets and small children walking into shows, so I think we're good. We'll keep rolling. But I think from my perspective, we've seen a lot of the vendors jump onto this term. It's now kind of the standard words you have to put into every product. But I was interested, and you alluded to it there as well. This is people, process, and tools, not just tools. You mentioned from a consulting point of view there, just really interested to maybe understand what's the holistic view that somebody should be thinking about as they think of zero trust and how to deploy this kind of new, well, not new, this methodology into their network.
Yeah, so I think to answer the question, maybe we should kind of think about the fact that it is, as we've been alluding to, sort of a stack, right? I think we kind of talked about that a couple of minutes ago. So zero trust isn't, one piece of technology or one SKU that I can kind of just go and buy and deploy, and then I have a zero trust architecture. It really is going to incorporate a variety.
Vendors would love it to be that way, wouldn't they?
Exactly, right?
Just buy my
Exactly.
thing and then you're done.
Exactly. And hey, I mean, that would make the job for IT operations easier too, right?
Yeah,
But
just buy this product and you're all done, tick.
yes,
Never as simple as that.
exactly. So, one maybe prime example that maybe I can bring to the table here to kind of walk through and break this down a little bit is so Dell has introduced what it calls Project Fort Zero. Dell talked about this at Dell Technologies World, and it's really been developing this since last fall. And what Project Fort Zero is, it's essentially, we can think about it like a reference architecture, so almost like a recipe for a zero trust architecture. And Dell is actually working to get this Project Fort Zero validated by the US Department of Defense. So that way, customers can really be sure that it's, checking off a number of those really critical check marks. I mean, if it meets those certifications, it's probably going to meet the security certifications of almost any industry. And so what Dell is doing in this case is it's working with the DoD. It also has an ecosystem of partners that it's working with. So vendors like Intel from kind of a chip and an infrastructure perspective, Juniper and Palo Alto Networks. We've already been talking about networking and VMware, are a number of other examples of partners that it's incorporating. So what Dell is doing is it's essentially trying to create this framework for customers so that way they can, maybe get some ideas in terms of some of the critical, technologies to look at and capabilities that they should think about. And then what Dell is doing is it's also offering, essentially, it sounds like it's going to be some, kind of support services. And really, we see that Dell already has close relationships with a number of its partners in a pretty strategic way. So then to be able to provide the guidance on, how to implement, and then maybe even how to think about what kind of guardrails are being put in place when we think, for example, about those access capabilities. So hopefully that helps to give a little bit of additional color. But that's one example that, again, maybe helps to kind of break this down a little bit.
Yeah, I think the focus on a reference architecture rather than a product is what I took away from that. I think we chat to product marketing people and product managers every day for briefings, and I see zero trust on, and it's almost a tick box exercise now. I think what I've picked up from this conversation, we need to be thinking wider than that. We need to be thinking reference architectures, people and process as much as tools. We're starting to think about wrapping up, but one final thing that's kind of top of mind for me, we hear a lot about zero trust. We hear a lot less about confidential computing. Conscious this is probably a topic for a podcast in its own right, but just really want to get a little perspective of where you see confidential computing and securing data in use as part of one of those reference architectures and more holistic views.
Yeah. So it's a good question. And again, it's interesting because from my perspective, I tend to look at, kind of backup data, quite a bit just in my role. So, when I think confidential computing, it is a little bit of a shift just in terms of that data that is in use. But absolutely. And maybe what I would add as well is the developments of quantum computing, I think probably play a role in this as well. And so the idea is, how do we maybe encrypt that data in a secure enough way that when it is in use, right, whether that be production or whether that be to access for, kind of recovery purposes, for example, that it's going to be secure and that it's going to be encrypted. And I think as an industry, we're still getting there. I know that there are a number of vendors that are working on what they call kind of quantum safe encryption. I know AWS had an announcement. We touched in our first podcast on their security conference that I attended, and sort of some of the double encryption features that AWS is introducing as one example to maybe help combat this. So I think those are some of the topics that come to my mind when I think about this. But I know, Stephen, for you, I know you've been looking at this quite a bit as well. So are there any other parallels from your perspective that you wanted to kind of bring up?
Yeah, I mean, I was out at Intel Vision a few weeks back. Obviously, at the chip level, there's a lot of focus going on with custom silicon. IBM's been doing a lot on this with quantum safe cryptography and also confidential computing for a while. AWS with Nitro, Intel's been investing with SGX at the chip level around these secure enclaves. I think you captured it right. We're still earlier days on this than maybe the zero trust part of the conversation, but I think for me, we've long been encrypting data at rest. We've long been encrypting data in transit. Data in use is the kind of final frontier. I think as solutions like AWS Nitro start to become more commonly used, I think we're going to see this deployed more widely. And for me, that's a good thing. We put a lot of trust in our cloud providers, but we don't know who works for these cloud providers, and they've got the admins for AWS, Azure, and Google, and IBM, and Oracle, and others. Fantastic people, one and all, but we don't know what they've got access to whilst processes are running on servers. And there's a lot of threat vector there and space for people to do nefarious things. So the sooner we can lock that down holistically, the better.
100%. And I think that's also why it's so important when we do think about the cloud that we do keep in mind that shared responsibility model. I know we've already mentioned that on this podcast, and it's just such an important topic because really, to your point, Stephen, that means that in this example, AWS does have, a responsibility to bring to the table secure infrastructure, but the customer is still responsible for the data, right, at the end of the day. So that includes things that we've been talking about today, like permissions. That includes capabilities like encryption that we've been talking about. So it's, I think, it's important to continue to beat that drum, so to speak, because it's, as we move more and more to the cloud, I think it's something that's going to continue to come up, especially in the context of cybersecurity.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think that's a great way for us to sum up here. It's been fantastic, as always, to chat to you, Krista. I always learn when I speak to you. I think our listeners will do the same. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was great as always.
So you've been listening to the Infrastructure Matters podcast. We're still building this, so please click and subscribe. Do all those things you're supposed to do, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks very much for watching and listening.